This episode represents exactly what we aim for when we launched The Evolving Leader, to bring fresh insight and ideas that challenge and inspire current and future leaders to ask themselves, who am I becoming? Here, we talk to the remarkable Jonathan Kaufman, who is leading the debate about how we can think differently about the converging issues of diversity, disability, and the huge market opportunities they represent. Our conversation ranges from his time as a White House advisor to Barack Obama to his current work as a researcher, consultant, and activist. His creative and optimistic mind is infectious, constantly reframing to find social and commercial innovation opportunities where others see stall points and roadblocks. There's much to learn here. I'm also joined by another member of the Evolving Leader team, Sara Deschamps, to have what is an amazing conversation. Welcome to The Evolving Leader, a show born from the belief that we need a deeper, more accountable, and more human form of leadership. I'm John Gomes, and today I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Sara Deschamps. Sara, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling curious, John. How are you feeling?
I am feeling very excited. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a few weeks now. Because today we're joined by Jonathan Kaufman. Jonathan is an incredible, innovative thought leader, business educator, strategist, who's regarded as one of the most innovative thinkers and practitioners in the area of diversity and inclusion, and organizational strategy and growth. And he marries a whole range of things together in terms of topics in this kind of intersectional field to help leaders think differently about the opportunities that this topic presents. His field work ranges from his appointment as the former policy advisor to the White House on diversity and disability to technical consulting for major Hollywood productions, such as Temple Grandin and Adam. He's the co-founder of J. Kaufman Consulting and was a longtime contributor to Forbes magazine and continues to provide strategy work in a variety of capacities, from helping Fortune 100 companies, government agencies to non-profits, helping them to articulate new strategies to enhance their organizational goals. Jonathan, welcome to the show. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling fine. When I sort of hear that litany of experience, I feel old, but I'm good.
There's a turning point where your credibility, you're building it up, and then all of a sudden it happens and you're going to go, oh, yeah, is that it?
Land and you say, okay, I've been here a while, which is good.
So Jonathan, let's imagine that we're at a dinner party and I don't know anything about you, I don't know anything about the topics, and I ask you what you do, and I'm a complete layman, say I'm a fireman or a gardener or something like that. What would you tell me?
It's always one of those questions because my wife asks me the same question every day. She goes, I don't know what to tell people what you do. I say there's sort of two ways of going about this. One, I'm in the helping profession because I think regardless of what I do, whether it's as a consultant, whether it's as an executive coach, whether it's as a psychotherapist or a speaker, I'm always in the helping profession. And the focus has been, whether it's from an organizational standpoint or an individual standpoint, to think about how we take challenges and problems and help solve them. There's a saying that anthropologists have, and having a PhD in applied anthropology, I certainly am aware of that, is that we are the professional strangers. And I always think that is a very apt description of what I do. I sort of go into organizations or work with individuals, and I am the stranger, but using the expertise that I have and the experience that I have, how can I help them in terms of transforming, whether it's human transformation or organizational transformation? That's a big key of it. And the other piece of it is always looking at the world through the lens of disability. I was born with cerebral palsy, so having lived that experience and understanding it, it was something that I needed to focus on. But what we recognize is this is really a value add and it's a strength. And I think that that has changed significantly, both here in the United States, but also globally. With the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it isn't just a sort of rights issue. This is a business issue. And if you sort of can reframe the lens, we're looking at things in a very different way. And in a post-COVID world, if you could call it that. I mean, my father's an immunologist, never calls it a post-COVID world. He said we're living with it. But in a world where the nature of work is changing and how we approach business in this very sort of fractured way, we have to look at the disability narrative and say, well, what do we learn from this? What's the experience we take from it? So in a sort of the long and short answer, I tell people I'm in the helping profession.
Jonathan, as you've just mentioned, and you speak openly about being born with a form of cerebral palsy, how has this disability influenced your life and the trajectory you've been on from a young age? And specifically, how has this influenced your mindset?
It's influenced my mindset tremendously. I mean, I think in terms of, I always see the world or experience the world through the lens of disability, and specifically mine, because everything has been about thinking strategically. And it's as simple as, going to the subway, for example, and knowing that I have to be on the left side. So, and how do I navigate through, a litany of people who are walking the streets of New York City? It's just, those types of things, or tying one's shoes. So it's sort of the mundane areas of life that you're sort of constantly thinking strategically. And that's always been the case. But what has happened over time is you realize that the way in which I engage with the world is always with a strategic mindset, is always thinking, trying to think, whether it's 10 steps ahead, but also looking at the whole sort of veranda, if you will, the landscape, and say, okay, well, let me think of different moves. It's always sort of constantly trying to think ahead so that I'm one step ahead. And that's given me this perspective that's useful in my professional life.
Okay, casting your mind back to the start of your inclusion work origin stories, there is a story I'm dying to hear. So the story that you have about meeting a certain Barack Obama at the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about this, and how did that shape your career?
I mean, it shaped my career. There were two people at the University of Chicago that changed my life. I mean, one was Barack Obama, which obviously sort of shifted me into that world. He was teaching at the law school. I was at what was called at the time the Committee on Human Development, which was a multidisciplinary program, and the School of Social Work and the School of Public Policy. And because of it, I was at the School of Public Policy, he was teaching classes on diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of in the law. And I ended up taking several classes, and simultaneously I was doing field work at the University of Chicago hospitals, where I was on a medical ethics committee with Michelle Obama for 3 years. So I sat next to her. I knew them before they were the president and the first lady. I knew them as professor, and he will always be professor to me for some odd reason. I call him professor in chief. But it was that experience, certainly, which evolved over time, because when I left Chicago, I went to Columbia University in New York. I came home to do my doctoral work, and then friends said, he's running for president. What do you think? I was like, yeah, let's do this. Jumping forward and being able to be involved with that. And I was actually living in Los Angeles at the time. I wasn't even in Washington, D.C. So what ended up happening was, when I came on board, I was flying back and forth from L.A. to D.C. and working on policy around disability. It was a sort of course. It went through the course of a bunch of areas in terms of getting there, and usually it was through friends. The other person, as I say, that changed my life significantly, and probably even more so, was professor. His name was Michael Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote a best-selling book called Flow, and it's sort of looking at optimal performance. And he was the father of positive psychology. So his philosophy and way of thinking, and I was able to study under him for 5 years. And the way he looked at the world certainly influenced me tremendously. So those two experiences at Chicago, and Chicago being this incredible institution, I mean, truly, I think it's some of the best education, if not the best education I ever had in the years I was there. But I think that it galvanized me to say, I want to be the scholar practitioner in a way, in terms of having that deep-rooted academic background, but apply it. And I was lucky enough to have a father who was like, this is what I do. My father is a practicing physician, but also professor of medicine at Yale University. So I had that model right in front of me. So it wasn't anything different. And I always think, okay, well, that's what I kind of do today.
So, Jonathan, let's try and get this big picture map of your thinking out there, because when we first talked together, it was very clear that you bring together an awful lot of different topics around your experience to help organizations think differently. And you're trying to help them to break out of either a compliance or do the right thing kind of way of thinking about these things to really understanding where the future lies, the opportunities lie, how to be truly progressive and innovative. Can you give us some sense of how you think about this?
Yeah, well, I think DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, has always been sort of a compliance-based because people are fear of litigation. And in a litigious society such as the United States, and I would imagine other places as well, but I know that for a fact living here, it's moving beyond that. It's thinking about, okay, one has to embrace this idea. And one of the things about disability, which always is very unique, disability is the essence of diversity to me. It's the sharp end of the spear. And often people say, well, wait a minute, it's not. Well, it's all about sort of compliance and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I said, well, it is and it isn't. Or the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, if you're going to look at it globally. And in fact, disability runs across race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic, sexual orientation, and it's the only minority group anyone can join at any time. And if you're lucky enough to age, we join it as a permanent resident, or we're a visitor, or we know somebody. So what does that say? We have to embrace the idea of this lived experience, and how does it translate into ways of thinking about the world of work. I've always been, I did my PhD in anthropology, focusing on the culture of work and the evolution of work. But I always looked at it through a disability lens and saying, this is the future. If you look at this narrative and say, what do we learn from it? What do we glean from it? And in this sort of COVID era where we're learning about hybrid work, where we're learning about remote work, where there is this tension between going back to the office and having that flexibility. Well, how do we learn about these transitions? That's the lived experience of disability every day, is that it's sort of constant transition. So what do we take from that lived experience, and how do you apply it? What's the application? And looking at it through a different lens and changing one's mindset about how do we approach this new world of work, and not be afraid of it, but actually embrace it for what it is and what it could be. Because you're talking about, this is always about thinking about the future and thinking about, okay, from in the present to now, change is inevitable. So embrace that change. And each organization is different. I always look at what the tension points are. And, part of being a therapist is, and you sort of bring that back, is saying, a company is an organism. It's a living, breathing organism. And often people say, well, And I was in Chicago where it was the land of Milton Friedman, where it was always about, okay, it's about the value of the shareholder. It's not about people. Well, that's changed drastically even in the time I was there. I mean, he was gone by the time I got there. But that philosophy sort of permeated in the economics department, and particularly in the behavioral economics department, which I spent a lot of time with. But what you realize is that philosophy is changing, where there is this idea of the sort of human element of it. And in this age also, where we're sort of butting up against new technologies, particularly AI. I mean, you can see this now on the other coast, dealing with the Screen Actors Guild and the writer's strike, in Hollywood. This is really critical. But if you think about it, just like everything else, when you look at the disability experience, we use tools. We use tools constantly, whether it's low tech or high tech, to live a better quality of life. If we reframe things in such a way and say, no, this is a tool, and it's there to augment your life. And in many ways, I'm a therapist. I put my therapist hat on and say, okay, how do we deal with the tensions? How do we deal with the struggles of any new technology or newness in general? And a lot of this future of work change is about newness, and it's about relationships. It's about the relationship to the technology, and what do we actually have to fear? So there's a lot here.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack, and I wonder whether we can just get a sense of examples where you're seeing, because part of what these tensions, these paradoxes that we have to constantly manage. What I take from your work is that people with disability, or people who've managed to deal with any form of discrimination and succeed in spite of it, what they've had to do is innovate in their system. They've had to break past the limitations of that paradox. And so as a kind of object lesson in how to evolve, how to progress, how to innovate, there's an amazing source of opportunity there. But often we don't really see it like that. We see that as a sort of, they're just remarkable people with qualities that are, and they are, but also they've done something practical. They've used tools in a different way. They've got a different mindset. So I'm really interested where you have seen organizations benefit from actually adopting some of that. And have actually created some progression, some innovation for themselves to do.
Yeah, I mean,
where have you seen this?
One of the great examples, I think, is Microsoft. Microsoft, I mean, if you sort of look at it, Satya Nadella, the CEO, his son Zane, had a disability, and so for him, the idea of accessibility had to become part of the DNA of the entire organization, and throughout, whether it be from the gaming side to software side to even hardware. I mean, they have an entire accessibility lab out in California now, which they've developed and are cultivating as part of their business. It's their business model. This isn't something where it's like, oh, this is an add-on. Part of the thing with the diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility, it's always been sort of an add-on. His philosophy is absolutely not. This is part of the core values of our business. So when you look at something like that, for example, I mean, another company which comes to mind, it's even more recent, which actually happened after the 33rd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was this past year, which was in July. Walmart came and said, well, we're going to provide for our customers a central site it's called Walmart Adaptive. So it's everything from clothing to, whatever they sell, where they curate adaptive products, and they partner with entrepreneurs who are in the space. And this is a space that's growing exponentially. Just in the adaptive clothing market, for example, Vogue Business said, well, this is going to be about a $700 billion industry by 2026. and in part due, yes, an aging population. Because you have to think about, okay, this isn't about, I think what we always think about accessibility, it's about sanitary. You and I are both wearing eyewear. Well, all three of us, actually, if I look at it, yep, that is an adaptive product. And if you look at eyewear as a business and say, wait a minute, or even if somebody is wearing, contact lenses, that's an adaptive product, but we don't think about it in those terms. Well, it infuses design, it infuses a level of aesthetic that changes the nature of how we look at disability from the outset. And a lot of the problem has been, if you sort of look at it historically, there were the ugly laws of the 18th and 19th century, which were taking place both in the UK and the US. Predominantly. And there were other European countries that adopted it, but it was very much part of the UK and the US experience, where they would separate out persons who looked different or wasn't part of the norm, whatever the norm was at the time. And that's where all of these institutions were developed to house and separate those with disabilities, change the very perception of how we see that. Now that's been done away with for the most part. There's still some that exist, but it's been outlawed both in the UK and the United States. And we're looking at living in place and finding community organizations. That in itself is shaping mindset. I think one of the great things that's happening now is the idea of social media is changing the entire conversation, because you have leaders that are coming out of the community, whether it's millennials or Gen Z, and saying, well, wait, we want to take back this. We want to create, we're young entrepreneurs who want to create products and services, but we want to create a difference in terms of how we see ourselves. And one of the things that's always important is this is a community that anybody can join. And it actually is the most inclusive, because you will join it. If you're lucky enough to age, as I said before, you're either a full-fledged member or you're a visitor. In some way or the other, it will touch you in your life. So in that way, we have to think. Now, again, there's lots of cross-sectionality, there's lots of intersectionality, and that can be adapted. But it's not only the lived experience that's important, it's how you apply it. How you apply it to work, how you apply it to products and services. These are the areas that I sort of continue to look at. And when people ask me, okay, what do we do about this? How do we get into this space? The big piece that's coming out now is disability tech, accessibility and those types of things, because it spawns innovation. And the next phase is venture capitalists and private equity getting in, and then it's a whole new ballgame, and that's starting to happen. I got a call from a French private equity firm, and they said, we have quite a bit of money, we'd like to invest in this, but we're sort of on the margins because we don't know what to do. And a lot of it is fear. It's sort of fear of doing the wrong thing. Well, everyone's going to screw up. It's just the nature of the beast. Life is not, you never get out of this, cleanly. It's messy, and that's okay, but it's part of the learning curve. And the goal is to say, what do you want from this in terms of our business? And I think, again, you look to companies like a Microsoft, for example, or a Walmart, and others that are out there. Certainly, Zappos Adaptive is another company that's done this. And then there are smaller entrepreneurs that are out there. In the UK, there's a brand called Unhidden, which is Victoria Jenkins, who's a fashion designer, who's created quite a successful brand in terms of adaptive products and particularly adaptive clothing. So you're seeing a groundswell now in the idea that entrepreneurship and developing products in a sort of host of different spaces are really impacting this new economy, what I call the disability economy.
I had read an article that you wrote, I believe it was for Forbes, about that marriage of design thinking and innovation in the disability space, and that it was fascinating. I'd like to go back to your two call-outs, which were Microsoft and Walmart as organizations who are leading the way. And for our leaders that are listening in, with that as inspiration, if you could offer them one action that they could implement today that would help advance inclusion, specifically disability inclusion within their spaces, what would that be? What could they do today to start?
Listen. I think listening and being, I said listening, but being observant of what are the needs. Needs are so important. And another piece of it is empathy. And people will say, well, that's a soft skill. I think it's a power skill. And it's a power skill because we're at a moment where business is not top down anymore. I mean, you have a way in which it's incredibly intersectional because people have voices and they can have channels where you can get to your customers. You can talk to your employees. So I think the first thing that has to be done is to take an internal audit of sorts and say, what do we need to listen to? What are we hearing and what are we not hearing? And there has to be a level of radical candor, radical honesty, and saying, here's what we do well, here are our points of tension, and here's what we need to improve on. Not that there's any failure. This is about growth and understanding that you're at we're sort of in this nascent stage of all of this still. But being able to listen is, I would say, is the prime directive right now. And then gather information and then evaluate and then say, okay, well, let's have an action plan. I do, when I work with companies all the time or individuals, more companies though, I do a corporate ethnography. And I, go in and try and understand the organization as a whole. It's not just how it runs, but the people, because it's the people who move, where the organization goes to and the direction, and understanding how people work together in concert or don't. And if they don't, why? And getting over the big, what I call, the F word, fear. Fear has been the biggest deterrent of all. And it's being able for people to, what we try and do is create an understanding of really where is that origin coming from? And why do people are so afraid? I mean, these are sort of the basic premise. It goes back to childhood. There's a book by Robert Fulghum, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And it's a philosophy book. And it was written, I think, about 25 years ago. And I still use it today. And it's very much that. The fears that people have, the tensions that people have come from how they were raised, their perception of disability. And then if you reframe it, for example, it's interesting. I remember when I was doing my psychotherapy training and I had to work in jails and I had to work with the former mobster who was a drug dealer. But one of the interesting things that we learned, and he was going straight and he was trying to get his life, we learned that he was a great marketer. A fantastic marketer. I mean, he was selling millions of dollars worth of cocaine a year. What we did was I said, look, step back. What are the tools that you're using to market this product? Because all it was a product. And what we realized is that this man was brilliant and understanding his customer base, marketing strategy, and what is he doing today? He's working for a very big marketing company. He worked his way up, and this is now, again, I was a student back then, so it's now 20 some odd years, I think, at this point. And he's doing well. But and another case is when you learn. When I worked with veterans, particularly when I work with the SEAL teams, and military. When you're coming out of the theater of war, how do you take the skills that one learns in the military and translate them into the boardroom? So going from the theater of war into a boardroom or working within a corporate environment, it's all how one translates their skills. That same thing applies with the lived experience of disability. Those experiences can be translated. And so I, in some ways, play an interpreter.
But what's so incredibly exciting about this conversation is if we think about the transformative effects that capitalism, business has had on society in terms of lifting people out of poverty and lifting people into a different space. Obviously, it comes with some downsides as well. That if organizations can see the opportunity here, that the world's biggest problems are the world's biggest marketplaces. If we go forward into the future, 10, 15, 20 years, the potential to transform society and to have more people who suffer from disability or exclusion in any form to be part of society and part of the norm, as it were, is incredible. So if you close your eyes, Jonathan, and sort of imagine what 2035 or further looks like, what's your dream? What's the kind of sense of your North Star? What do you see happening?
Well, I think it's my thesis advisor was a linguist. He was a French linguist. And so I think the language of disability will change. I think how we look, the word may be there, but even the meaning of it changes. But also more importantly, that's a sort of more academic component. But I think the immersion of disability as part of the marketplace, we're seeing it now, where it becomes part and parcel to everyday life, and saying, wait a minute, there's 1.8 billion people on the planet with disabilities today. It's a $13 trillion market. Okay, so why aren't people leveraging that and mining it for what it has to offer? And I'm hoping that that will happen. And just like everything else, there are conferences, there are young entrepreneurs that are coming up. There are pipelines within the universities. There are pipelines outside the universities. But it's becoming part and parcel to sort of everyday life, and no one thinks twice, whether we're looking at bionics and in terms of, okay, we can experience disability, we can celebrate it for in this way, we can celebrate difference, but we also can see the value add to society. And that's the key piece for me is, how is this a value add, and how can we create opportunity? Because I think activism is one way, and that was always the beginning. That's always where the flame has started. But we need other avenues to build on that, to be on the shoulders of that. And that's where ingenuity and entrepreneurship and creativity come into play to changing the mindset of how we perceive this and reframe this community that in truth is truly the most inclusive of all.
So shifting to the past, so understanding your vision for the future, but going into the past, could you tell us about some of the tech that's now ubiquitous in our life that was originally born from innovation inspired by disabilities, and maybe what impact this will have on the future as well?
The one that comes to mind is texting. Texting is ubiquitous, but where was it founded? It started at Gallaudet University in 1976. And for those that don't know what Gallaudet University is. It's a university in Washington, D.C., designed predominantly for the deaf community. And the idea was, okay, we need to communicate. So this notion of texting, and look, we didn't have cell phones at that moment in time, but it's this idea that we can use text-based models. And this is now transformed. I mean, I have teenagers. That's all they do is text. I mean, they don't call, they text. That's become ubiquitous in our society. So that certainly is one piece of technology that's been democratized, for lack of a better word, which everyone uses but doesn't know its origin. And its origin story begins in the disability community.
Wow.
One of the points you raised earlier on was around this need for empathy, because organizations, product designers all struggle because they stay in this kind of design space that's propelled often not by the problem they're solving for, but the idea that they've got.
Right.
And this concept of product market fit is starting to become take more hold. But when it comes to understanding an audience that you really do not have any lived experience of, it has to take more than just the CEO having a disabled child, or somebody being injured on a motorbike and wanting to kind of make their life better, so they plow their millions of R&D into it. How do we get better empathy about the situations? How do we structurally embrace empathy into organizations?
I think one of the things is you sort of have to combine it, and there has to be a marriage of empathetic thinking with problem solving. Why do we go into business? Why do entrepreneurs exist? They're there to solve a problem that hasn't been solved yet. And so one of the issues that always has been it's in the DNA of persons with disabilities is the fact that the world wasn't made for us. The world wasn't designed for us, so we've had to have hacks left, right, and center and so I think when you're looking at the nature of business at its very essence, it isn't about shareholder value. Despite what Milton Friedman said, it's about solving a problem, big or small. And so we have that choice. And in order to sort of think about problem solving, we have to go to the source. Who are individuals which are great problem solvers? This community in a variety of ways, and using that type of mindset, that way of thinking that can be beneficial, and then recognizing, wait a minute, this is a $13 trillion market. Why aren't we considering this as something? I mean, what's also interesting too is that we live in a culture that is sort of driven by celebrity. So when you see celebrities suddenly, who are seen, it's interesting. In the UK, you have the royals. We have the Kardashians. That may be our, whatever. Or we have celebrity. I mean, the cult of celebrity is there. But when you see celebrities, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. It really doesn't. And you see celebrities who are open and vocal about their disability per se, then people take pause and they look and they say, well, wait a minute, if it can happen to them, and look what they're doing. And some do nothing, and some are very vocal. And that I always think is a positive, because what it does is it, again, changes the nature of how we look at it. And companies now are saying, wait a minute, we can use this in our advertising and our branding. For example, L'Oreal has sort of taken notice where they're creating new products for mascara, that is designed for people who have Parkinson's or physical disabilities, to make it just easier. And somebody like actress Selma Blair, who's been very vocal about her MS and writing a book about it, and Mean Baby, but also very open about that, and her starting her own line, for example, of fully accessible products. Says, wait a minute, there is a marketplace for this, and there is a celebrity behind that, or somebody like Selena Gomez in Rare Beauty, who is focusing on mental health. And when you're talking about disabilities per se, it's not just all physical. The majority of people that are in the disability community are those that are non-visual, in the sense of mental health issues, or somebody who is on the spectrum per se, on the autism spectrum, to be specific, or somebody with a learning disability. Perfect example of that is Richard Branson, who calls dyslexia his gift, and is very vocal about learning disabilities, and has become a real champion in that regard. And I think it's wonderful, because that in itself, you're saying, wait a minute, here's the diversity of disability unto itself. It's not just about a person in a chair. It's not just about a person who has crutches or has an orthotic. But most people that you walk down the street, you would never know, well, this person has, MS, this person has schizophrenia, this person is dealing with depression, all falling under the umbrella of disability.
If we could stay with the aspect of mental health, in your thought leadership, you make reference to mental fitness, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that, about this term.
Yeah, mental health is sort of really focusing on, the action of learning and dealing with psychic issues. Mental fitness is focused on the action itself. How does one deal with one's mental health? And that can be from, for example, self-care is a part of mental fitness. What is one doing actively to not only manage, but thrive? For example, we're in this age now where burnout has become an enormous piece of it. In this COVID world, I had a patient who is dealing with social anxiety. And she said to me during COVID, now everybody knows how I feel. But it's and that was during the teeth of COVID, what I call the teeth of COVID, so, 2020. But what was interesting in this way, and I can bring back to my therapy practice, because I think that's probably the most apt here, is the fact of what is one doing actively in their day-to-day? We talk about physical health all the time. We talk about exercise. But there's a mental exercise that people need to do daily, which is really doubling down on the notion of care. How do we care for ourselves? What are the activities one needs to do to feel better about themselves in terms of their mental fitness? And there are a variety of ways to do this. And people have, whether it's listening to music or going for a walk or just having silence, what is it that people need to do to rejuvenate themselves in between their temples as much as their physical body? And that in itself, it's a long journey, and it's different for everybody. But what we try and do is figure out, start where the person is. And that's, again, start where the organization is and what's needed so that you can be. And I go back to Michael Csikszentmihalyi, who was talking about how do you get to peak performance, or the optimal experience, as he used to call it in his Hungarian accent. I will not do it, promise. But that's the idea, is how do we get to a place where we're more comfortable? I'm not going to say completely, because I think that's the journey in itself, but feeling a sense of peace and equilibrium.
I'm a huge self-care advocate, and I'm dying to know. I'd love to know, what's your favorite self-care ritual?
There's a few things. I mean, reading is one. I mean, it's always sort of constant. Music is another. Um, I like taking walks if I can. It's that I think it really depends, but definitely reading and music. I love watching old films. I have this obsession with films from the 30s and 40s, um, and so certainly that's it. But I'm a movie buff, so I think that's also sometimes it's just being able just to turn my brain off. Um, and again, this is not something that's in the UK, but I'm an enormous fan of baseball. So for me, the summers, because there's something very bucolic about the sport itself, and being able to spend an afternoon for 2 hours watching a baseball game during the season. Unfortunately, my Yankees suck this year, but that's okay. But that for me, there's something rejuvenating about it.
You talked earlier about a kind of needs based
Yeah,
form of thinking
yeah.
to help move this game on. Can you expand that a little bit so we can see a little bit more about how leaders in organizations can use that form of thinking to make progress?
Right. I mean, I think that the sort of focus is always for companies. Okay, well, we have to hit our mark. We have to hit our numbers, and rather this needs basis is very. It's how to understand the human experience in this, and saying, okay, we are trying to be the best company. We're trying to have a competitive advantage. But in order to have a competitive advantage, one has to understand, what does the organization need? What do individuals need? What do teams need so that they can be at optimal performance? That's the mindset. And it's changing that. And a lot of the executive coaching work I've done, particularly more recently, has been focused just on that and saying, well, how do we listen to one another so that whether you're sort of at the top at C-suite, which in many ways, they're focused on a variety of different issues. But I also think you need to take the moment and the space to listen to those needs so that, one, we can create the mechanisms so that individuals in their organization can feel invested and feel that the organization is invested in them. It's you're creating an alliance, and it's really important to understand what that alliance is, and that there has to be an ongoing conversation. And if that conversation breaks down, then ultimately the company sort of loses its way.
So if you think about all of the kind of conversations you're having with the C-suite in the last 18, 24 months, clearly you're making a big impact in some areas. What are the more kind of stubborn or resistant beliefs and mindsets that you need to kind of help them to kind of move past? What are you seeing there?
5-day work weeks, which is an interesting one, and we can play with that. Who created that, and is it necessary? And I think, look, but it's also this idea of, what does the future of work look like? And fear. It's like, oh, well, if they're not going to come back to the office, well, am I going to have a company? Am I going to be productive? What does that mean? But also, it's the lingering effects of COVID. I mean, I have to tell you, so for 2.5 years, I stepped away literally from doing consulting because that's not what I was asked for. What people needed was traditional psychotherapy. And it was infused with executive coaching, I think. But, company, whether companies big or small, were faced with, how do we navigate through this unknown? And one of the things you learn from the disability experience is that there's always unknowns. The world wasn't made for me. Suddenly, we're in this box. And how do we negotiate this? How do we deal with, particularly those that were in the C-suite, well, how do I deal with my employees? How do I make payroll? How do I deal with the anxieties and the stress of sort of getting through the next week? And how is the business going to survive? So I was in triage constantly. I was constantly trying to pump life and into organizations and individuals and hold a lot of hands for 2.5 years. And being able to understand, okay, how do we focus on not only mental health, but mental fitness? Because the mental fitness needed to be infused to get you through the week, the month, so on and so forth. And then also, how do we restructure businesses? How do we restructure in terms of working with our staff, working with our teams? Is the business still right? Is it functioning in the way that it should in pre-COVID times to now in the teeth to where we have to look ahead? And that always focused on the idea of the future of work. Being able to be nimble and emotional agility, which was a key factor in all of this, played such an enormous role in this. So as I've now come out of this and companies are sort of coming back and saying, okay, so what do we do now? Now it's the now. Let's move forward quickly. But there's also been, I think, I would say, and I can't speak for outside the United States, but we're in this presidential cycle now, and we're in a very polarized country, and there is this, I must say, in our house, we call him the Orange Sphincter. It's sort of Voldemort, the name that should not be spoken. Yes, that was given by my wonderful daughter, who has a fabulous imagination. And he's not the cause. He's not the root cause. But he's
I think the tanning goes everywhere.
Awful. It's just awful. Yeah. Yes, and I like the image of Orange Sphincter. But the idea of this notion of wokeism, and I'm not sure it's productive. It's that sort of political divide. And I say to myself, okay, I understand it in the sort of political arena, but does it work in the day-to-day business? And then you sort of step back and say, wait, what is there to learn from it? I'm not one to criticize. I think I'm one to say, okay, what worked, what didn't work? And now that we understand what didn't work, let's look at this in a positive direction and say, how do we have to pivot to understand where we need to go? And one of the things that I was saying why the sort of presidential cycle is everything's been amplified about what's wrong. What are the problems? I don't think that's a solution. I think the solution is, okay, let's look at what worked and what didn't work. And let's think about the philosophy of a company and understanding what are corporate needs. And you can go back to Abraham Maslow in his pyramid of needs, and that may be important. But I think we collectively speaking, have to understand what is the purpose of an organization, what is the purpose of one's business. Yes, solve problems. Yes, create jobs, generate the economy. But all of that has to be integrated to understand, well, how do we make it run? How do we make it run effectively? And I think that's where we are. And, my little world, or big world, whatever you want to call it, my goal is to really look at connection and belonging and leadership effectiveness, but through this lens of disability. And why this is so important, because I think of disability as human variability and part of the human experience. And it's a framework that I happen to use. Doesn't mean that everyone has to use it, but it's a framework that allows me, not only as an advocate, but to say this is a pathway to understanding the human experience and a mindset that people can leverage in a positive way.
I'd really like to try and get some progress in my mind around the polarization topic, and particularly around the nature of woke, versus non-woke, or however you want to look at it, and the fact that you've got a real block in many people's minds here that this is a no-go territory. It's just too difficult. I don't know what to say. I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to, it's too risky. How do we break out of this so that we don't have, you're either in this camp or you're not? How do we move past that?
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that it's so polarizing. Let's get to the fact that we're going to get it wrong. You know what? We're going to make mistakes. Life is about. I mean, again, I go back to the Robert Fulghum book. Everything I learned to know, I learned in kindergarten. Right? We all make mistakes. That's how we learn. And I also think that there is this way in which we dehumanize people. And we say, oh, well, they're only this, they're only this, and they fit. If you actually talk to somebody and say, okay, what are our similarities rather than our differences? And what you'll find is there are a lot of similarities. People want to raise their families. People want to be able to go to the store and buy food. Basic human needs, when it comes down to that, what we recognize is that we're all part of this human family. And because of that in itself, that connects us. Yes, we can celebrate differences, and that's important, exceedingly important. But I also think it's just as important to recognize where are the bridges. And building bridges, I think, to me, is much more powerful than burning them. And it's critical to find where are those connecting points. And that's what I try and do all the time.
Yeah. I love the fact that we keep on tying it back to this needs-based thinking. I think that's a really great unifying. It stops this either-or type of thinking that seems to be so prevalent at the moment. We're running close to out of time, so there's a couple of questions that Sara and I would love to get in before we say goodbye to you. But we're really interested on the evolving leader in different ways of thinking about managing uncertainty, because we're all living in an increasingly uncertain environment, so it would seem. Yeah. You've touched on a few things here, but how do you think about the disability mindset and how that prepares us to think differently about the future?
I mean, look, I'll bring in my sort of own experience. Since I've been born and being raised, uncertainty has been part and parcel to everyday life. Because one day I don't know if I'm going to walk, or one day I'm physically not feeling well. There are always ups and downs. So recognizing that you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and maybe that's the way to think, in the sense of saying we live in a world of uncertainty. That's a given. That's the reality. So if we're comfortable being uncomfortable, and getting to that place is not easy, because many people sort of avoid it and we go into our shells. But if we're going to move forward, we have to recognize that failure is an option. But not that we stop. We sort of evaluate, and what do we learn? What do we do differently? It's a level of boldness to understand that uncertainty is the reality of life, or else we can just call it a day and hide in some hovel somewhere and not do anything. But if you're going to challenge yourself and you're going to say, okay, we're going to try, and it is about trying. By the nature of trying or doing, that level of uncertainty comes along with it. It's it's part of it's the passenger in the ride. And how do you face it is going to be the real challenge of one person's life or organizational life, to say, we may not get there, but what are we learning in the way? And is it the journey or the destination that's more important right now? And one of the other things that I think is really important is, is breaking things down into very small bits. I sort of use a baseball analogy is like you don't have to get up to home plate and hit a home run every time. Or, in football, you don't have to score a goal every time. But how do you pass it to the next player? How do you build teamwork? How do you understand that you're not alone? And the ability to create and build relationships, that again comes back to needs. Because what that does is you have a level of uncertainty. But how do you minimize uncertainty to a certain extent? It's by building teams, and it's by positioning yourself in ways that you're around people that are different from you, that have different skill sets than you, that have different strengths than you, and recognizing that. I think some of the the best leaders are the best team builders. That's where success comes in. And I think building teams are important. I recognized in my own life very early on that I needed help. And being able to ask for help is one of the most, it's not a weakness. I think it's one of the great strengths that people can have, is to say, I need help with this because you can do this better than I can, and you can do this better than I can. And collectively, we can become very powerful. And that, I think, is going to be sort of the next step, is understanding personhood and being able to connect with others who are like-minded, who will help one eventually move forward, organizationally or individually.
Jonathan, reflecting on your own journey and your own lessons learned, are there any moments in your career that, if you're looking back on them today, with today's lens, with today's knowledge, you maybe would have approached differently? Or can you think of any standout moments where what you did in the past would maybe no longer work today?
I mean, I think there are a lot. I haven't really thought about it at great length because sometimes I'm just sort of so focused on moving forward. But I think if I were to sort of contemplate, I'm at this point, I don't have any regrets. I have to say that. I think everything is a learning curve and everything is a learning experience. So I'm grateful. And I think gratitude for me is the lesson that I've learned for everything. I'm grateful for the life I have. I'm grateful that I have a disability because it taught me so many lessons. It is my teacher. It is my teacher every day. So I don't have, and maybe this is naive of me, but I'm grateful for what happened and how it happened, because I go back to it and I always say, okay, would I do it differently? Maybe. But more importantly for me is, what are the lessons I've learned from it that propelled me forward? That, I think, is how I look at it. I don't have regrets. Or I don't say, would I do it differently? Because that's where I was at that moment in time. And I only had this much information to gather. But I recognize everything's a building block for me. So how do I grow from it? I'm sort of my father had a saying, and I believe it truly to this day. It's a mantra. We're all in the act of becoming. And if we're all in the act of becoming, I'm still becoming, and we all will be becoming until we're 6 feet under. So I'm in this act of becoming. That is my journey.
I love that. We are definitely all in the act of becoming on the Evolving Leader. That's the whole idea. We're not the finished, product, nor should we be in seeing ourselves given the responsibilities that leaders face today. Jonathan, this has been an absolute dream. Thank you so much for spending time with us. What's next for you in the coming months ahead? What are you excited about?
I'm excited about a few things. I mean, summers are always a little slow. So now it's getting back to consulting life, also starting a sort of new platform, a thought leadership platform, through a broader lens, where I'm doing a regular weekly LinkedIn newsletter. I'm starting a YouTube channel, and then videos on Instagram. So I'm playing around with lots of things. But for me, I like to teach and I like to express, and and explore ideas. So I think that's a big piece of it. And then getting back to speaking, during COVID, it was not, it sort of dried up, and I think now we're at a point, and collaborate with great people. I think for me, one of the nicest things, because I work on my own as sort of I'm a lone wolf, I guess, as they say, but I love collaborating and being able to do that where I can bring my expertise to the table and add value. So that I think is sort of the next 6 months to a year.
Brilliant. Well, we will add details in the show notes about how people can get in touch with you and watch all your great material, because there's an abundant source of great stuff for people to engage in, and a lot more than we could possibly cover in our time together. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for spending time with us. We wish you great success, and I look forward to doing work with you in the future. And for now, we say goodbye. Remember, the world is evolving. Are you?